Hi, it's Dr. Isom, and I'm here to talk to you just a little bit about the Big Five and how the Big Five replicates or doesn't replicate across different cultures in the world. When personality psychologists are investigating the 5 factors or the essential traits of personality and whether those are universal or not, what they are trying to do is understand first, what are the traits that fully capture personality? Are they the same across different cultures? One question that has been really of interest to personality psychologists from the United States in particular is whether the 5-factor model, otherwise known as the Big Five, is appropriate not only for the United States and Western Europe, but for other cultures as well. Another question of interest is whether within cultures there are meaningful subcultures that might actually differ significantly from the dominant culture on personality traits. There have been many studies that have been designed to compare the same traits across different cultures, and here's an example of one. This map shows levels of extroversion measured across the world. For those countries that remain white, they weren't able to measure levels of extroversion, but for the other countries, this map shows that the most extroverted countries in this study, done by Gardner et al. In 2018, are Mexico, Hungary, and Bulgaria, and the least were Singapore, Japan, and Hong Kong. People who live in Mexico are much more extroverted than those who live in the United States. And that makes sense to some extent if we think about our culture as being more individualistic in the United States, whereas the culture in Mexico tends to be more collectivist. People from collectivist cultures are more sociable. They spend more time in social interaction. And as a result, they score higher on extroversion than people who come from more individualistic cultures. An interesting study mentioned in our textbook talks about how countries that are located near the equator are found to have lower levels of extroversion. And the hypothesis for that is higher levels of extroversion and sociosexuality and openness and other traits that promote social interaction are the ones that would be most likely to spread infectious disease. And so it would make sense that countries on the equator where infectious disease rates are higher would have fewer people who are extroverted and overall lower scores in sociability. What I gather from that is that infectious disease may have a long-term effect on levels of personality in a culture, especially in countries with very high levels of infectious disease. People who are most sociable are most likely to catch contagious diseases. And it makes me wonder if COVID-19 is selecting out people with certain levels of personality traits, and whether the personality of our culture will be affected as a result. Okay, shifting gears a little bit. One of the main questions for psychologists studying personality in different cultures is whether traits are the same across different cultures. And the research has shown that overall, the Big Five have been found in more than 50 cultures, but it's not the only variation that has been found. Some studies of personality, including studies that have used the lexical approach, have identified anywhere from 3 to 7 traits instead of the typical 5-factor model. And it's been argued that for some countries, perhaps 5 factors is not the correct number of traits. Perhaps it's closer to 3 or as much as 7. Overall, there's been strong evidence for only 3 of the 5 factors across all cultures studied so far, and those are conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness. And so these are the traits that are considered to be universal at this point. However, a recent study that just came out in 2019 investigated response biases and problems with administering the 5-factor tests across different cultures. And essentially what they concluded that the reason why 5 factors have not been fully established across all cultures, and especially cultures that are more rural, has more to do with difficulties in being able to translate the items into terms that are consistent across cultures, especially for cultures that are less economically and technologically developed. In many cases, the 5-factor has to be administered orally, and so some of the results may be more related to response biases associated with having to administer the test using that methodology. So it could be that the 5 factors are universal, or they may not be, But the way that the test is administered at this point in countries where it's not able to be administered on the computer or by paper and pencil may be artificially limiting or inflating the number of traits that are found. Differences in the number of traits that have been discovered may be more related to the methodology used to administer those tests and to score people's personality than to the actual number of traits themselves. So it could be that the number of traits and the specific traits may vary and differ across different cultures, but it also could be that differences that have been found that are not consistent with the 5 factors could be related to patterns of responding across different cultures. And that limitations in the ability to translate personality items to be consistent across cultures, as well as oral administration rather than computer or paper and pencil test administration, may largely contribute to those inconclusive findings. One always popular question is whether men and women differ in personality around the world. And one study measured over 23,000 people across 26 different cultures to address this question. They translated the NEO, which is a well-validated 5-factor measure, into several different languages. And what they consistently found across cultures was that women scored higher in neuroticism, agreeableness, warmth, which is a facet of extroversion, and openness to feelings. Men scored higher in assertiveness, a facet of extroversion, and openness to ideas. And what's interesting about this is that the largest differences between men and women appeared to be in the more well-developed countries, the more industrialized countries and societies. The Big Five across the culture of the United States has also been investigated. And in this study, Renfro et al. Compared the 5 factors across the entire 50 states, and they established in general there's 3 types of people in the United States, grouped by geographical location. The first type, the friendly and conventional, which you'll notice is the blue region, which is on the top left, the states that are variations of a shade of blue, and what we would typically call the Midwest, the upper Midwest, for the most part, and some of the mountain states, as well as Florida and somewhat the South. These are what Renfro et al. Called the friendly and conventional type. And that's people who scored higher in sociability. These tend to be the most considerate people, the most polite, the most dutiful and traditional as far as following traditional ideas and values in the United States. The next type, the upper right, is the relaxed and creative type of people. And that you'll see is heavily weighted on the West Coast and a little bit on the Mid-Atlantic area. And you can see this does not describe people in the upper Midwest at all. So what are the relaxed and creative people? These are people who scored higher on openness. They tend to be more tolerant. They also tend to be more individualistic and creative, and they score lower in neuroticism. And the last type that Renfro et al. Identified were the temperamental and uninhibited type of people in the United States. And these are heavily weighted in the New England, New York, Pennsylvania area, as well as somewhat in Texas. They describe the temperamental and uninhibited type of people as those who tend to be impulsive, who are irritable, who tend to be inquisitive, are passionate, and also very competitive. So, are you living in a compatible part of the country? Or maybe you can use this to figure out where you want to get your first job after college. Now, why do the states fall into these 3 different types? Well, it could be that people who have personality traits consistent with those locations tend to migrate and live in areas where like-minded people live because they may feel like they fit in those different states to the extent that their personality matches the types of people that live in those states. Another possibility is that weather conditions may selectively influence personality characteristics because weather influences mood. There's potentially many reasons why people that are similar congregate in those states. I'll bet you might have some thoughts as to why people with similar personalities tend to live in the same place. Now, this is an interesting way to parse up the different states with personality, but we need to remember that just as in cultures that are associated with different personality traits, there's always subcultures that may differ greatly within each of those regions. it's likely that there's subcultures of people with very different personality characteristics that may differ greatly from these overall types, which is one of the big issues that personality psychologists need to face. And that's the fact that, especially in the United States, we are not just one unitary culture. There are many, many subcultures in the United States, and there will continue to be a huge diversity in the people that not only have lived in the United States for many years, but that continue to move to the United States from other countries. And so it never has been easy, but it'll become increasingly more difficult to define the culture of the United States because of those important subgroups. And in addition to that, people often belong to more than one culture. They may identify with a specific ethnicity related to a country that they emigrated from, as well as being a part of the individualistic American culture, which can be argued only adds to the rich, colorful tapestry and the incredible diversity in our culture. But it also makes it more difficult to characterize and identify with one culture. In fact, there is something called bicultural identity integration, and this is the extent to which a person who has two different cultural backgrounds is able to integrate them successfully so that they don't cause stress. As the result of identifying with two very different cultures that have opposing ideologies and opposing values and opposing emics. To the extent that the cultures that a person identifies with are disparate and in opposition to each other, that will have a negative impact on an individual's bicultural identity integration.